Hi everyone, my name is Sina Rabbani and I'm the Dean of the DeMatteis School of Engineering and Applied Science at Hofstra. I started as a faculty member at Hofstra back in fall of 1990. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for the DeMatteis School Executive Speaker Series today, Dr. Ron Piervincenzi, who's going to talk to us about the pandemic and the global medical supply chain. We all have noticed how coronavirus pandemic disrupted the supply chain for various products, most notably making the toilet paper a prized possession. The pandemic may mark a rebalancing of where drugs are made as nations recognize the security imperative. Today, the majority of ingredients necessary to make our medicine, more than 80% of it, are sourced from outside the United States. And as trade tensions between America and China continues, US dependence on these ingredients coming from China or other countries is becoming an issue, and some even argue it could become a national security concern. USP is playing a critical role in the public health response to COVID-19 by helping to accelerate the work of scientists, whether it's that they're developing vaccines or other treatments, or they're also working on helping to build a more resilient global medicine supply chain. After all, as you saw how the humble toilet paper threw us into such a disarray, imagine the consequences if the drugs that you need for your survival are not as readily available. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Piervincenzi, a proud graduate of Hofstra University. Ron earned his bachelor's degree in bioengineering in 1993, and I'm privileged to have had the opportunity to have him as a student of mine when I started my career at Hofstra. Ron went on to pursue his master's and PhD in biomedical engineering from Duke University. He has served as the CEO at the US Pharmacopeia since 2014, and in his role, he provides a strategic leadership to USP's global staff of over 1,200 across 10 global sites. In his tenure, USP has launched a number of key initiatives in order to bring the quality across the healthcare spectrum and upholding the reputation as a quality leader since its founding over 200 years ago, exactly 200 years ago in 1820. Under his leadership, USP has modernized its operations and launched innovative new science, including in the areas of digital medicine, cutting-edge manufacturing, technology, and advanced biologics. And for the students in engineering and computer science in the audience, they can see the interrelation or intermarriage between technology and medicine in this arena. Before joining USP, Ron was Vice President of Development Sciences with Biogen, and prior to that, he was a partner and leader in McKinsey & Company, global pharmaceutical and medical products practice for over 12 years. He's also proud co-founder and chairman of the board of New York Mentoring Movement, and Ron also serves as a member of my Dean Advisory Board at the DeMatteis School. So without any further ado, I would like to turn our Zoom session to Ron, and we are all excited to hear about his work at USP.
Thank you, Dean Rabbani. It's a wonderful introduction. Actually, it saves me some time, so I really appreciate that. It is true, I am a proud graduate of Hofstra, and I've never really lost my connection. But I think in recent years, I've spent more and more time working with Dr. Rabbani on the future of SCAS and its elevation to a school and its very bright future. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I hope I can shed some light on a big, complicated topic. My goal is not to simplify it for you today, but show you the reality of the complexity, so you have a sense of all these moving parts. And maybe in the future, when you're reading these articles about drug shortages and such things as trade wars around medicine, you have a little bit of a sense of where things are coming from. I'm going to start by trying to figure out how to change my slides. There we go. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a sense of who is USP. We're a bit of an unusual organization. So I'll take a couple of minutes just to share. Bulk of my talk is going to discuss the medicine supply chain. What is it? Who are the players? What are they doing? Very briefly, I'll talk about some insights on supply chain vulnerability. And so really what we mean here is a broad area of the things that can drive and lead to shortages and other issues, but many things can lead to shortages. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those insights, but they're very early days. That last section is really a teaser to a new set, a multi-million-dollar project that we've begun in earnest over the last couple of months, and we're going to commit to do for some time to bring transparency to an issue that really is quite opaque to the public in the world today. So back up to the top. Who is USB? So this is a mural from 1820. You may see that cycle over this shoulder over here once in a while. We were founded by 11 physicians on January 1st in 1820. A few of whom were members of Congress, 1 senator, 2 House members. And the job was to fix the very broken and poor medicine supply in the US. We show some pictures up here of literally wizard oil. The medicine in the US was completely variable by what city you lived in. Poor quality, even poisonous medicines were imported, really dumped on the US from England. That was what we had at that time. And remember, the country was just getting going. There was very little to do. There was very little to the federal government at the time. There was very little that was federal at the time in the country. We didn't even really have an army in a proper sense. So that was a bold move to create a single set of standards, rules for what medicine looks like in the US. So our mission then, and still today, is to improve health through standards and other training programs to ensure the quality of medicines. Okay, that's very high level. Let's get a little more practical. Over the years from 1820 to today, the US government, of course, grew up and medicine got more complicated. And over those years, and usually, and in fact always, unfortunately always, in response to a public health crisis due to medicinal poisoning or poor quality medicines, congressional acts were made to increase the regulatory oversight of the medicines in the US, including in 1906, the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which created for the first time the US FDA that really came into being in 1938. So at that time, it was created, USP had already been in place for 100 years as an independent nonprofit and was actually written into the law. So in that way, USP, although an independent scientific nonprofit, is in a sense a semi-official organization, and the USPNF and our standards are very much official for United States commerce. How do we do this work? The organization does not have nearly enough people to cover the work of thousands and thousands of medicines across just the US, not to mention the rest of the world, as I'll describe later. It's really a 3-part game. Our expert volunteers, these are scientific experts that join, and in the many hundreds, this is a very large group, 800 to 900 scientists who commit for 5-year terms to be on our expert committees to do the hard work of setting our standards with support from our 1,200 or so staff and scientists who work full-time in the laboratory and in other roles. Equally large is our partnership in stakeholder groups, for example, US FDA, the World Health Organization, pharmaceutical associations, pharmacy and medicine, especially represented by the practitioner associations, and many others, including academia in both medicine and pharmacy especially. And then finally, the third is the specifics of our government and regulatory relationships. So in this case, it's not just the institutions, but those institutions, the US FDA and 50 additional countries, regulatory agencies officially recognize USP standards as the rules by which they approve and also test and monitor their whole medicine supply. What are these standards I'm talking about? Well, I'll show you the old-fashioned version, although we don't make books anymore. But at one point, they were books. In fact, they were books for about 199 years. While we've been going online for some time, now we officially and completely digital. But imagine a book, not one, but 6 of those. That's what it takes to cover all the USP standards today. 6 volumes, thousands and thousands of pages. It's much better in the digital format and much, much easier to lift on an iPad or an iPhone. So that's what our standards are. They're lists, they're chemical tests, they're procedures to be followed, tests that you would then perform on a medicine to see if it is what it says it is. They're not tests to tell you if the medicine will treat your disease. They're not tests to tell you if that medicine won't have an adverse effect, but they are tests to make sure that the medicine is as it's supposed to be, and it is what it was when it was originally tested and approved for use. On the right-hand side, importantly, are tools. These, for example, are what we call reference standards, so small chemical samples that are used in the laboratory as a gold standard, essentially. How do I test what I have? Well, I use the reference standard to measure and to make sure that what I'm looking for is accurate. There are other tools that we have that we provide to laboratories, both in industry as well as regulatory authorities, to be able to do the testing on their materials. And to give you a sense of the scale, I think our current number of individual documents in our documentary standards on the left-hand side here is about 6,000. And on the right-hand side, we have over 3,500 different chemical standards that we ship around the world, nearly 1 million vials shipped a year to 150 countries, I think 22,000 locations. So it's really widespread. And we'll come later. That's one sign of how complex the medicine supply chain is right there. So I mentioned earlier that crises often drove the legislation that added regulatory strength in the US and actually other countries as well. Here are a few examples that are more recent. This is not going back to the early 1900s, but really in just the last 15 years or so. There were, in the first case, actually in the first two cases, these were intentional adulterations to save money. So fake ingredients put in place of real ones. But in these two cases, the fake ingredient not only made the medicine not work, but was actually toxic to the point of creating deaths in both situations, both for diethylene glycol as well as heparin. The third's a little different. It's really malpractice. There were multiple, but there was in particular one egregiously poor compounding pharmacy, which is something in between what you would receive on essentially it's a custom therapy made by a pharmacist on demand for a specific patient for a specific need. It's a bit like miniature manufacturing for a personalized use. And there was a particular pharmacy that did such a poor job that created fungal infections that killed many people. So each of these leads to the notion that you not only need standards, but you need a system around those standards to ensure that they're adhered to. Just real briefly in the world, a little bit of where our organization is based. We see on the right-hand side is where our staff are in the world. We are mostly in the United States still. Our main offices are in Maryland and in Washington, DC. We have a large and growing group in India that have been in place for about 20 years, a couple of hundred staff there, most of whom are scientists working in the laboratory. We also have staff in India, China, Brazil, Basel in Europe, several offices in Africa, and a couple offices in Southeast Asia, including in Singapore and Indonesia, where we do a combination of development work, working with governments, as well as outreach to industry to help them to use our standards to make sure they can make quality medicines. Here comes a fun chart. I'm gonna let you watch it, and then I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna repeat it one more time. This is showing the global shipments of USP standards around the world by year. I show it the second time, I'll talk through a little bit what's going on, but just so you see what this is. I told you before we ship many of these standards, and of course we keep track of where they go. This is a map over about a 20-year period that shows you where the medicines are being made. Our reference centers are a really good indicator of the places that medicines are made. So let me go back, show you this chart one more time. I'm gonna try to go back. Good. So watch it one more time and watch the evolution over just the last 20 years of where medicines are coming from in the world. Remember what Dean Rabbani said about China? They weren't even on the list for 7 years. So what we have and what we call our medicine supply chain today has not been that type of a supply chain for very long, which also means we haven't quite figured out how to make it work. This evolution is not done. Already in 2020, we can tell you that for USP, we're shipping more standards to China than India already. So that change is happening so quickly, more quickly now even than in the past. So what does this mean as we look around? Well, think about where people are in the world, of course, and some of it starts to make more sense. India and China alone represent nearly 2.35 billion people. So it seems perfectly reasonable that it would be a place where you'd be able to produce quite a bit of medicine. But there's more going on under the surface than that. If you look at, sometimes in business circles, they refer to it as the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China. You watch on here on this list, you see a lot of those same countries: Brazil here, Mexico, South Korea. What's happening there is you're having middle income countries that are learning to produce more and more of their own medicines. And once they're doing that, they start to produce and also to export those medicines to other countries. And unlike, let's say, automobiles, where you only have a few countries where cars are made, medicines truly are made almost everywhere. And then we're going to keep showing this over and over again if I can't figure out how to switch to the next slide. There we go. So now I've mentioned it a few times, the medicine supply chain, and you're probably wondering exactly what is it? It means different things to different people, but I'm going to give you the broad definition. What's used, let's say in technical circles when we talk about the medicine supply chain, what might be used at the World Health Assembly of the WHO when talking about challenges or opportunities. So first, just to grab your attention, these are some headlines from, I think the oldest headline on this list is 2 months. It talks about what Dean Rabani mentioned. This is literally news. I forget the number somebody shared. I think I've conducted almost 30 interviews in just the last 3 months with news agencies talking about supply chain shortages, misunderstandings about the supply chain, nationalist backlash against importing medicines. You name it, it's a hot topic. It's political, it's scientific, it's economic, it's health. It's about all the things that people care about when they go to the ballots, when they sit at the kitchen table and talk. So it's real and it's live today. This is one view of the pharmaceutical supply chain. Any product starts with ingredients. Medicine's no different. Ingredients for medicines have special names. We won't go into the details there, but sometimes active ingredients, excipients, coatings, colorings. It's all the things that are ingredients into medicines. Other ingredients you don't think of as ingredients because they're not in the medicine itself, but vials, packages, packaging and labeling. And for some medicines, those are very specialized. Like for example, for vaccines, there are very specialized glass containers that have to be created. And there's already worries that there may be shortages if not addressed. And the US government had just made a contract with Corning, upstate New York, to produce extra quantities of this specialized glass for the materials to make sure that that is not one of the barriers to vaccine production once a vaccine is discovered and approved. So ingredient suppliers, lots of them, and usually, and almost always, in fact, they're not the same as the pharmaceutical manufacturer. So again, I use the car analogy because it's more intuitive, at least for me, and probably for most of you. Ingredients, somebody makes a tie rod, somebody else makes a drive shaft, somebody makes tires, somebody makes car seats. The manufacturer is Ford or Toyota or BMW. They're putting those pieces together. The manufacturer might make some special parts themselves, but almost all of the supplies are imported to them. One difference between medicine and cars I mentioned before is that there are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of pharmaceutical manufacturers. There are only handfuls of auto manufacturers. So what you have here is a lot to a lot, whereas in cars, you have a lot of ingredient suppliers to a few manufacturers. Then once the drugs are made, there are thousands or at least hundreds of manufacturers. How do they go from there to get all the way to the patient? Well, things get even more complex then. So those medicines are moving into what's called wholesalers and distributors. There are aggregators, think of them as aggregators, buyers of all the medicines from all these different companies, put them together and then sell them one step closer in the chain, generally to hospitals or local pharmacies or pharmacy chains. Then those local pharmacy chains are looking and they're making their purchases to eventually be able to provide them to the patients. So this is the pharmaceutical supply chain by the category. But of course, a lot of people talk about the pharmaceutical supply chain by things like the map of the globe. And when you look across this, it's written with some terms like wholesalers and distributors, which tends to be a bit more of a Western country, US, for example, terminology. But every country has a pharmaceutical supply chain. It has to cover all these major areas. This simple graphic is a little bit of the sense of many to few, except that for the pharmaceutical industry, there might be for a single medicine, 20, 25 different companies that make that medicine for a generic, for example. That those generic companies are each buying their APIs, their excipients, their ingredients, some from the same places, other times from different ones. It really is unknown, in fact, not just that we don't know, but there's no way to know it. So the complexity there isn't so much that we know there's many ingredient suppliers to many manufacturers. We don't know. In fact, it's possible that 20 manufacturers are all buying some of their ingredients from one source, one company. Meaning that despite there being 20 companies manufacturing a drug, one ingredient goes into short supply, all 20 may cease making the medicine. And this is what you've read in some of those articles I shared earlier, or the headlines, talked about an API shortage. Some of the APIs or the active ingredients have one or two manufacturers in the whole world. Let's say, for example, in China, where most of the API is produced. And although you have 20 companies manufacturing the medicine, they're all buying it from the same place. So if that same place is unable to make medicine or unwilling to sell it, the entire supply of medicine would stop. Now, this is an image just to show you how different the supply chain can be by country. Is a different cut. The picture on the left is just what I showed you with a couple of nuances, because as always, it's never as simple as you show your first chart. But it more or less, you see on the left-hand side what I described for the US. The right-hand side is actually Nigeria. Is an example in Nigeria. We have an office in Nigeria and work there quite a bit, so it's something that we're quite close to. In Nigeria, it's not that it's more complex, it's in a way that it's less centralized. There's a purchasing upfront often done by the country. So in some ways, it starts more centralized, but it becomes decentralized because there's not as sophisticated a network of pharmacies and hospitals as there is in the US or there would be in Europe. And so it becomes more complex, and therefore, one of the unfortunate circumstances that is in Nigeria, by the time the patient receives the medicine, there's about between a 20 to 30% chance that the medicine is substandard or even completely false. Substandard means essentially it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, and falsified means it can be completely fake, up to 20 to 30%. And so that's a whole nother issue that we won't be talking about today in specifics. But when supply chains fail, it doesn't always result in shortages. It can result in plenty of medicine, but unfortunately, medicine that doesn't work. So we talk about the upstream supply chain. Again, more of these fancy terms. We just mean early on in terms of the manufacturing. So why is it so vulnerable today? In some ways, it feels more vulnerable. Here are a few reasons that have driven some of the risks into the system. Pressure on margins. For anyone who's taken any business classes, this is basically, think of it as profitability. The generic industry is not a very profitable industry. The drug industry overall is profitable, and branded drugs can be extremely high profit. But the majority, in fact, the vast majority of generic products are very, very low margin, very low profit. And in order to be able to produce those, companies have to get very, very lean. Sounds good, be lean, be smart, don't waste any money. The challenge with generics when they get that lean is that they start to lose their resiliency. They're able to only purchase their ingredients just before use, for example. The second one I talk about is insufficient incentives for quality. I'll go back to the car example. The incentive for quality is very clear. You have public organizations who test. You read Car and Driver magazine or Consumer Reports, and they tell you if you make a bad car, they'll put it all over it. Don't buy the Toyota Camry because the brakes don't work, and all of a sudden you don't sell your car. There's an incentive for quality. There's also an incentive for quality to the user. You purchase cars, you think they're great, or you think they're not very good. If they're not very good, you won't buy that car again. In medicine, we don't know the quality. You don't know if it's going to have the right amount of your ingredients. You can't look at it, you can't tell, you can't test it, you can't test drive it. Even further, some of the even sophisticated parts of the supply chain, your pharmacy chain, for example, even they don't know. They don't have the tools to be able to test your medicine. So we're relying way upstream on the regulator, on your government regulatory agency, and the manufacturer itself to do all of the right testing. And if there's no incentive for quality, if nobody knows it's there, then they're not willing to pay for it. And if no one's willing to pay for it, it tends to become in short supply. So there's very little incentives for quality. And finally, talk about agility. In most manufacturing spaces, as soon as the market changes, if there's more demand or less demand, you quickly change and you make more or less or a different kind of product. Medicine, the regulations on medicines are strict enough that it takes months or even years to shift to a demand. Most shortages in medicine are not driven by changes in demand. For example, high use because of a pandemic. That's actually relatively rare. Most shortages occur because of problems in manufacturing or gaps in the supply chain. Natural disasters, factories who don't meet standards and are making poor medicine that get shut down. Those are the sort of factors that mostly affect shortages. However, there are changes in demand, and regardless, even if a company was shut down for poor quality practices, a new company can't just quickly make a product because it takes months or even years to be able to ramp up their systems, get approvals, and be able to produce the medicine. So all three of these, lean production without backup plans, no incentive to make a really good quality product, and hurdles that prevent people from reacting, means when things happen, things go wrong, shortages occur easily and they can't be quickly rectified. So again, you come back, you say, underlying it, it's not because anyone is necessarily being evil, there's no necessarily bad players involved, but the whole system is set up in such a way to not have a very strong robustness. I'll give one example for, we say branded medicines. Before a drug is generic, there's literally a single company, by definition. One company makes it. You would think that makes that drug the most vulnerable. But in fact, because there's an incentive to quality when only one company is making it, when there is a higher profitability, and the regulatory and logistical hurdles have already been overcome, you actually see fewer shortages. The company who has that patent protection will create more than one factory. They'll create redundancy. They'll have backup plans because nobody else is going to make it. So they know they have to be the ones with the backup plans. When you have multiple generic companies, the other companies are your backup plan. So nobody is covering for the other. But if something happens to all of them at the same time, like a pandemic or a natural disaster, there is no backup plan. So these are the facts. Shortages are real, and they're not only here because of a pandemic. In fact, although the shortages are up and rising this year, you'll see that there have been many, many years with very high numbers of drug shortages in the US, the richest country in the world. This goes back over 20 years. What has driven some of these shortages? Well, some of the spikes in shortages have been driven by tough economics. You notice a rise after 2007. Everybody felt the economic pinch. Generic companies, just like everybody else, pharmaceutical companies tightened up on their expenditures, were more careful about their R&D, and what happened is more and more drugs ended up in short supply. Other spikes that you might not see in the total numbers were driven by natural disasters like the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is disproportionately responsible for complex sterile products, which are basically like drugs used in medicines, IV bags, even simple things like sterile saline. When the hurricane hit Puerto Rico, it wiped out all production for several weeks and damaged some facilities so badly that it was almost a year and a half before they were back up and running. That alone created a worldwide shortage in some of the hospital products. Very inexpensive, easy to buy products until, of course, they weren't because of the hurricane. And when I mentioned earlier, no one else was able to jump in and produce it for many months, and so those shortages were real and became very troublesome for pharmacy managers and pharmacists in hospitals, not only in hospitals, but especially in hospitals. So they're not new, and we see them rising. The number here for 2020 is just from the very beginning of the year. We're likely to see a number this year that's higher than probably any other on this list by the time the year is over. So I mentioned earlier about substandard and falsified medicines. This is an example where we are quite fortunate in the US. You'll see Europe and Australia in a similar, that less than 1% of the medicines that reach a patient will suffer from substandard or being falsified. Less than 1% does not mean it's not an issue at all. As we talked about earlier, there were examples where this does happen, but they are very small. But 10 to 30% of medicines, imagine that 1 out of 3 times you walk to the pharmacy, the medicine you take home doesn't work. That's hard to imagine if you've grown up in the US or you've grown up in Europe. But in much of the world, that's our reality. What the chart doesn't show that's even more disconcerting is that in many of these countries, there's actually 2 supply chains. So if you grow up in India or China, the local, the domestic supply for most people without the means is going to be suffering from a high number of substandard and falsified medicines. But if you have high income, you're able to purchase from special hospitals who are buying their medicines from outside the country, from highly regulated markets like Europe and US, and you're essentially getting the same supply of another country. And I think that one of the problems is that economic disincentive means the people with the most money and power are getting the good medicine and feel less of a need to improve the quality of medicines for everybody else. If you look at the strip across, you're going to see that as you get closer to the equator and as incomes drop, you see more and more substandard medicines. And it's a public health challenge that can be fixed. This is an easy one to fix. We know the solutions, we know the plans. So it's not my discussion for today's talk, but I'll just put it out there that sometimes we have our blinders on in some of the Western countries and we don't open up and look to the rest of the world. So now we talk a little bit about solutions. I've given you a lot of bad news. I've tried to scare you a little bit. But as I mentioned before, the solutions are proven. We've done them in different parts of the world, and they're actually not even that expensive. And in some cases, they won't cost money at all because there'll be enough savings from not having medicines that don't work reaching patients that they'll pay for the cost of doing a better job in the first place. More, not less supply chain diversity. So this is where I'll talk a little bit about the fear of nationalism. And I don't mean just in the US, but the first reaction in many countries to the shocks like the pandemic or natural disasters is, oh, we should stop buying medicines from other places and make everything ourselves. Well, it takes 6 volumes just to make the standards for medicines at USP. No country on earth, very much including the US or very much including China, can make all of its own medicines. So that's not a solution. Making some of your own medicine is a perfectly good thing to do, good for economic development, why not? But why do I say more, not less diversity? Rather than trying to import less medicine, I'm not saying import more, I'm saying import more diversely. So on that running bar chart I showed, you saw all those different countries. Well, if you're buying your medicines from India, only India, or only India and China, but you also now start to purchase from Mexico, Argentina, Korea, you continue purchasing from Europe, all of a sudden you start to have much more diversified sources and you're more resilient to any kinds of shocks, political, natural disasters, or pandemics. Second one about manufacturing for critical medicines. Ironically, or perhaps there's a better word for that, the more critical a medicine is to human health, the more likely it is to be relatively cheap. And the more likely it is to be relatively cheap, the less incentive there is to manufacture it, the fewer companies who make it, and the more vulnerable they are to supply chain shocks. There's no shortage of Botox in the world. There never will be. But we're constantly having shortages of antibiotics that save lives, ointments that treat pregnant women who otherwise hemorrhage to death on their hospital bed. These are medicines that can be 30, 35 years old. So investing more in the capacity for the most critical medicines is actually a relatively easy one, relatively inexpensive, and has the benefit of creating more resiliency even to manufacture medicines that might go into shortage that you haven't thought of yet. I'm going to leave the third one out, transparency and data sharing, for the next slide. We'll talk more about that one. The crisis contingency planning is what I described that, let's say, a brand name company might do. I said an individual generic company, it doesn't make sense to do it. I still think that that's true. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It can be done. It can be done by others who are purchasing medicine. It can and should be done at the country level. It can and should be done by large hospital systems or large pharmacy chains. One of the barriers to doing better contingency planning is the note above it about not having the data. And again, we'll come to that later. And then the last one is having a strong regulatory system. I showed you a chart with the substandard medicines around the world. There's a direct correlation, no coincidence, that if you don't have a strong regulatory authority who can make sure they can test and measure for the medicines in the market, then the more substandards that you have. Building a regulatory system in countries is a very inexpensive way to protect public health. And the work is very much underway. This is a story that's showing success over the years. This is a good news story. We're not done yet, but the world is making big advancements, and USP is playing a small but important part in that. So transparency and data sharing. What do we mean by that? Well, much of the information I've been sharing with you has been relatively new and very spotty. I'll give you a simple example that tells you how difficult this is. Right now, if you purchase a generic medicine and you ask the pharmacist, where did this medicine come from? The pharmacist probably can't tell you. In some cases, they might be able to figure out where it shipped in from, but you don't know if that's where it was made. Even if you did know where it was made because you made some phone calls, you wouldn't know where the ingredients for it came from. And they would not have to tell you even if you did make the phone call. And if you did make the phone call and you did reach the person and they were willing to tell you where it came from, they probably wouldn't know themselves because they probably didn't manufacture it themselves. They're probably the manufacturer of record who actually outsourced the job to somebody else. So I think you get the point. That's for one medicine. Try to do that over 6,000 medicines, changing on an annual basis. And this is what we call our data problem. So if you don't know where the medicine comes from, and then somebody says, create a plan to make sure that you're resilient in case there's a natural disaster that hits New Jersey. And then you say, but I don't know what medicine's made in New Jersey. Well, then how can you make a plan? It's really that simple. So what we've started to do is we took a step back and we asked, what data would we need to really know where our medicines are coming from in the world, to see where those supply chain problems would occur, eventually to become predictive, to say, hey, watch out, we could have problems in antibiotic supplies. This is a set of work that requires a huge amount of data, and even more, making it more complex, a huge number of data sources. We've started with just 20, although we need many more. Most are public to some degree. None of them are perfect. None of them are perfect even in and of themselves, and they certainly don't add up to all that we need, but it's a good start. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, I'm going to show you one chart that's going to give you an example of the kind of thing we want to be able to come out of this effort. And in our Q&A, perhaps I can answer a few questions if anyone would like to know more about it. But really, the point of this is really that we need more data, we need more insights if we want anyone to be able to make good, informed decisions. So this is literally, we started this project only about 6 weeks ago, and this was our first completed analysis. So you're seeing it. Here it is, our first analysis. We plan to do hundreds of these, but we have one down so far. We did a mapping. Essentially, this is really broad. It encompasses almost all the drug classes that we have in our medicine supply today. And we did two different measures, actually three. The x-axis, the bottom axis, talks about its geographic concentration. We know that geographic concentration is vulnerable to both natural disasters, but also political strife and trade wars. On the vertical axis, we talk about a customer quantity. So this sounds complicated, but what it basically means is, hey, how many different companies? So you might be geographically concentrated in one country, but you may have 20 companies. You might be geographically dispersed in 5 countries and have 5 manufacturers, 1 in each country. So that's why those are on different axes. And then lastly, the size of the bubble is simply the amount of medicine. And that is less important for this analysis, but worth noting for later. So we did this map, and the way we've arranged this on the left and the right is such that the upper right-hand corner, where you have very concentrated manufacturing in one part of the world and very few companies, these are the ones that on this one measure about concentration would make them absolutely the most vulnerable to shortages. And then of course, as you move down to the lower left, you'll be the least vulnerable to shortages. And the first thing we did, we just looked back at the shortage list and said, well, how does that track? And then we haven't completed a true analysis, which takes use of statistics, but it's true. So dental and oral agents, specialty products in the hospital, bipolar and other neurological agents, hormonal products, these are very often on the shortage list. So we know that this is true. There are other drivers, of course, for shortages, which are not linked to the concentration. And so we know that wouldn't expect it to be fully correlated. So what's interesting about this chart isn't so much the insights, it's that it's never been done before, that nobody's been able to do this sort of analysis before. And so we've just started with this combination of what's public, and what I didn't mention is sort of one of the keys to unlocking this is the use of the USP standards. We have data about the online usage of our individual standards, what rules and tests people are using, the physical products that they're using, the physical reference standards, and essentially through these thousands and hundreds of thousands of data points a year, mapped against where the companies are in the world, and quite a lot of work to join our data sources, we start to get not just a static, but a live image of where medicines are coming from and going in the world. And through that vision, we can then start to link it to specific medicines. And ultimately, you could then take a occurrence, a pandemic, a surge in the need of a specific kind of medicine. For example, hydroxychloroquine sales went through the roof 7 weeks ago with early data from Italy, and then through the floor with more recent data from WHO that says it doesn't work. Such volume spikes are very painful to medicine supply. But if you don't know where the medicines are coming from, there's really not much you can do about it, even if you know the shock is coming. And the last one that Dr. Rabbani mentioned was political strife and trade wars. I actually think that might be the most serious risk to the medicine supply chain, because it's a lot harder to mitigate. It can be extremely sudden and quite unpredictable. Fortunately, although there's been a lot of noise during the pandemic, we haven't seen, I would say, serious problems, but there have been holding back of medicines. Many countries, including Europe and the US, India, have restricted export of certain medicines to make sure their domestic populations had access. And as one country does a restriction and then another follows up with their restriction, the whole supply chain starts to cramp down. And this is why we've seen some of those shortages. I'll mention this now as we take a step back and think about a special case, vaccines. It's not special in the sense that it's another kind of type of medicine, but it's a special case because, as we know, there's about 150 projects that are seeking a new vaccine for coronavirus. Of those, there are probably at least a dozen or so that are in men for testing. Let's say a few of those get approved, one or two of them seem more promising. They'll instantly have over 5 billion people that want that vaccine. It'll probably take 2 or 3 doses in just the first year. So you're talking about 15 billion doses. We've never delivered a medicine in that at all, ever. And we certainly have never done it in a single year. And we certainly haven't done it in a single year in the first year. And on top of that, many vaccines require special refrigeration, special packaging, and special delivery by a healthcare practitioner. So I mention all that. Imagine what will happen if the first company that discovers it is in Boston. How will it be different if the first vaccine is being manufactured in China or in Europe? What do you think the political ramifications will be, the expectations of those countries? And if those reactions to the virus start to threaten other countries, what if they pull back their own exports of other medicines in retribution? So we look ahead to the virus, as much as we are all rooting for it, we also have to be aware of some of those, I think, very serious problems that can be caused by a real issue. It is a real issue that we can't produce 6 billion doses of a vaccine in the first month of its production. And even if you could, how would you distribute it around the world? And the last part, I would bring this back around. If you look at a world map and you imagine the production of a vaccine, it won't be discovered in Nigeria. It won't be discovered in Bangladesh. When will people in Africa and Southeast Asia get access to the vaccine? It's likely to take months, if not years, before meaningful quantities of the vaccine can reach those populations. And in a pandemic, you can't treat the people of New Jersey and think that'll be enough. So we come back to this. The global supply chain can only work if all participants are adhering to the same rules and looking to support each other. And I hope this is a little bit of a view to bring some bad news, maybe some good news, and I'll end with a little bit of that watch out on the vaccine. So keep your eye on that vaccine. Watch for signals from where that vaccine is coming from. Look for the countries that are perhaps fighting, perhaps cooperating. I think it's going to be fascinating. Thank you, Dean Rabbani. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Piervincenzi. So I have gone ahead and turned the chat feature back on as we move into our Q&A portion. So if you do have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat. And then Dean Rabbani, if you'd like to facilitate, or Dr. Piervincenzi, if you just want to answer as they come through. I think if they start coming through too quickly, maybe Dean Rabbani, you can unmute yourself and help.
Perfect. Thanks, Carrie Ann. I have my chat box open, so I'm ready to read.
Perfect.
I think my mother is one of the participants, so she's not allowed to ask any questions.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Dean
Yes.
Rabbani.
She was trying to make sure I'm stay on mute. Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Ron. So as you described, there are a number of challenges, and these are very serious challenges that intrinsically exist, even if you put aside all the politics that usually in this situation, like many other situations, tries to take center stage. So how do you propose then? You cannot make countries play fair by just asking them to do it. What do you think it needs to be done from perspective of the big players, big countries, to make sure that the fairness is in place, so not only people who live in US can get these vaccines on a proper time schedule, but everybody can? I mean, what can we do as citizens of this country, or what should we expect our politicians to do to make this possible so the global supply chain would work?
Yeah, so it's not hopeless for vaccines. Because there will be so much demand in the world, there's actually room for both things, which is room for profit to the company who is able to, or the companies, if there's a few, who do the research and discover a vaccine that works. At the same time, there's the opportunity, and I think it's an essential need to be able to do technology transfer to other entities to be able to also manufacture those vaccines, but not in some bootleg kitchen sink fashion, in a proper fully what's called GMP, or good manufacturing practices environment. That requires the sharing of data and information that you typically would not do in a normal circumstance. And I can't imagine we can treat this as a normal circumstance. So that model has been used for compassionate use. Some countries will just do it anyway. They'll just say, we desperately need this. Let's say Colombia decides that they can't wait 6 months to get the first dose of the vaccine, so they just reverse engineer the vaccine themselves and produce it, but it might not be exactly right. So the notion here is to avoid that model, to ensure that there's licensing, or something called compulsory licensing, which is sort of like the good part with a little bit of a push. So that's likely, but what happens if, I'm not sure that the countries right now are really even talking to each other, and the US is pulling out of the World Health Organization, so that doesn't seem like it's going to be much of a venue for that dialogue either. So I'm not sure how that collaboration will happen.
Thank you. Our first question is by Carol Forlick. Carol is asking, how can distribution be improved then? What a mess we recently witnessed with COVID PPEs as an example. And what is your answer to that question?
Yeah, so, the PPE example is not a bad one for medicine. It was a bit more extreme because we don't have a therapeutic. Had we had a therapeutic instantly says, oh, this medicine really works, we would have had as extreme a shortage as we did on the equipment side. And a further thing is equipment or toilet paper. Is the shortage, well, partially for equipment, definitely for toilet paper, was driven much more by demand rather than supply issues. There is no less toilet paper in the world being manufactured today than there has been for years and years and decades and decades. And it's still in shortage in the stores because everybody is hoarding, which is not different than medicine. If every country decides we're going to buy all the possible medicine in case we need it, there'll be a massive shortage. This is what happened with hydroxychloroquine, and nobody gets it. So how do you prevent such purchasing and such behaviors, or why doesn't it happen more in medicine? I think the reason it doesn't happen more is that there are rules about getting prescriptions and prescriptions filled that lessen the ability to rush to the store. You can't rush to the store and buy all the RX, all the prescription medicines you want. It's not a perfect system, but it is limited, so you see less of that demand. And I guess the last thing I would say is people don't feel the need to rush and buy something if they think it will be there tomorrow, what the economists talk about. And so if you have trust and faith in the supply chain, you have no reason to hoard. If you're not hoarding, you won't have the shortage. And without the shortage, you can have the trust.
Thank you. Next question is by one of our faculty member in computer science, Dr. Steve Lindo. Steve, as you can see the question on the chat, Ron, has a question regarding adverse reactions and the role FDA plays there. He knows that FDA job is really to keep these adverse reaction databases, which is really becomes a lot of big data. And from a computer scientist perspective, a critical issue, as these databases are kept as current as possible. Is the same thing true for other countries and the supply chain and the databases we have on them?
Yeah, so in the last 10 years or so, there's been increasing collaboration across countries at the level of regulatory agencies. And there's complicated sounding acronyms and terms that are not really important, but there's more and more data sharing occurring for things like adverse events is actually a very good example, but also for things like clinical data to approve new products and new drugs. Some of it is actual literal sharing of data, and some of it is really just agreeing to what is data. Do we call it the same thing? Do we follow the same rules? So eventually when we share the data, it'll be useful. Originally, they tried to share data with each other and it wasn't at all useful because it was comparing apples to oranges and it didn't actually help. What's interesting, I think even more specific to this presentation, is adverse events come in two flavors. One flavor is this drug will sometimes give people a rash. Did you get the rash? Log it. Are we getting more rashes than we should expect, or is it okay? But the other kind of adverse reaction is I took this medicine and I had a rash. And you call up and say, well, this medicine doesn't cause rashes. What's going on? Oh, so did 6 other people. And then you go back and you find out that there was a problem at the factory. There was an impurity added that was causing these. In the news right now, unfortunately, most adverse reactions aren't so obvious. And there are cancer-causing impurities called the nitrosamines that are popping up in some cardiovascular, actually other medicines too, but including cardiovascular medicines, just in the news this last year or so, and especially repeated up again about a month ago. So these are found, and of course you don't know that they were increasing your risk of cancer until many years later. So the adverse events come in these two flavors, and the one I just mentioned that was the cancer causing is actually a manufacturing change that introduced the impurity that shouldn't be there in the first place. So those actually result in the product quality, and they're in some ways even more important because those can be fixed. A medicine that just sometimes causes rashes is a side effect that we know about and we have to live with and make the best of because we get a benefit from the medicine. But nobody should have a cancer-causing chemical in their product that shouldn't be there in the first place. So I mentioned that second category because that one is even more important to share globally, because often people are buying medicines from the same companies in different places.
And Ron, are these problems more prevalent with generic drugs, or it doesn't really matter? The issue of safety and problems introduced, is it more prevalent with a generic drug, or it's also prevalent with actual branding?
So I think the biggest issue here is that human beings are not very good at statistics. Our brains are not wired this way. And so you could imagine, say, well, 9 out of 10 times I hear about these things, it's a generic. Generics must be terrible. Except that generics are 9 out of 10 of our drugs. Mm-hmm. So the reality is it's probably about the same. There are different kinds of issues though. And so, there's some nuances, but most quality problems are generics because most drugs are generics. It's probably not more complicated than that. I did mention earlier, though, that the fact that generics are so low in their profitability that as companies cut, it can cause problems. So I think there's probably a bit more of these troubles pop up in the generic medicines than you see in their sort of more expensive branded counterparts.
And next question is by Joel Ryder. Joel is talking about the fact that, as you know, a lot of medicines are cheaper if you buy them in Canada than in US. So is that medication, is it really the same product, or could the quality also be different for a medication such as Synthroid?
Yeah, so this is actually, it's perfect because it's just what I was just talking about. The generic medicines are on average about 10 to 15% cheaper in the US than Canada. It's the branded medicines that are cheaper in Canada because the Canadian government negotiates when they purchase the drugs. They negotiate a lower price, and then they purchase the drug into their healthcare system. In the US, the US government is not allowed to negotiate. They have to pay whatever price the company sets. That's the federal law. So we pay too much for the branded drug. So it's kind of as simple as that. So oftentimes it will be cheaper. And if you're sure you're buying from a Canadian pharmacy, you might get the same product for the same price. Unfortunately, USP is a founding member of a group called Medicines We Can Trust. And about 97% of online Canadian pharmacies have nothing in Canada, not a drug, not a person, not a computer, not a single piece of fiber optic cable. 97%. So if you're buying your drugs from Canada online, you're almost surely not getting what you think you're getting.
Next question again is by another faculty member, Dr. David Klein in the DeMatteis School. And he's wondering if USP also specifies the coding of reagents. So we are talking about the non-active ingredient in the medicines.
Yeah, that's right. The excipients, especially special kinds of excipients. So yes, our standards, in fact, it's a very important part of our standards. Most of medicine is excipients. Sometimes it's over 90% of the medicine, so it definitely matters. It's not just the coatings, but especially coatings are involved in product release, which can often be very important. There's a nuance, what people sometimes call complex generics, where it just basically means, you know, harder to make medicines. Things like extended release and such that become more complex. And the more complex something gets, the more things can go wrong. So the answer is yes, increasingly so. There's more and more innovation in drug combinations, which are drug combinations with devices, specialty coatings, drugs in combination with software. So already I'd mentioned that there were thousands of drugs. Then you multiply that by drugs in combination with something else, and you end up in potentially millions of final combinations of products. So the complexity is growing, you know, orders of magnitude over where it was even just a few years ago.
Next question, Ron, is by Greta Kraus, which is asking specifically about vaccines and how, if you know, if the amount of dose of a vaccine stays the same, or is this something, I assume they're talking about shelf life here, if I'm not misunderstanding, if it will actually change by time. I'm not clear whether I'm understanding the question.
Or it might be how many doses you would be required to develop your immunity. It's not usually so much a result of the disease as much as the way the vaccine was created. So a killed virus versus a recombinant, and one actually is leading in time, at least the leading vaccine of all of the 150 is actually a very, very unique RNA-based model, which is nearly novel. It's exciting, and it was able to be produced quickly. But the short answer is we don't know. We've never done it before, and we don't know how many doses it will take. And it certainly matters. You know, 1 dose versus 3 triples the problem of supply of the vaccine to the world. So it matters enormously. But we don't know. There's a simple answer. And because we're rushing things for good reasons, but we're rushing them, we might not actually know when we approve the product where we normally would. Normally we're in clinical trials for years. This time we may only be for a year. And so we may be a little bit doing a test on the world all together at the same time. We may be entering into a 6 billion person clinical trial.
So to follow up on that, how safe the public should feel then when a vaccine has become available, which I assume animal testing has been done, and then they make sure the dose is such that it's not going to kill you, but actually protect you. What's the minimum number of population size you need before average person should feel comfortable about?
Well, you probably should ask Anthony Fauci. But you know, the number you need to know is how infectious it is, and we're starting to get a reasonable sense, because the more infectious it is, the higher number of people need for herd immunity. Mm-hmm. And of course, herd immunity is within your community, and so it doesn't help if everybody in America is vaccinated and nobody in Nigeria. Then in Nigeria, everybody would be infected. So the answer is probably something like 70%, you know, but we don't quite know yet. And that may not sound very high, but certain people cannot be immunized or are very dangerous. I know there's one person on this call who would rather not have such a vaccine because it can trigger other autoimmune disorders. And so that 70% actually is pretty high. With elderly, with very young, if you exclude certain people with other medical conditions, you realize that almost everybody would have to get the vaccine who's eligible and who it's safe for.
And Dr. Edward Carey, again, one of our faculty members, asking about relying on world good seems a very risky proposition, going back to the question I asked first. So how are we coming up with contingency plans for that? Let's say one of these other players who's involved in here decide not to play fair. Yeah. How we protect our citizens in the country?
Well, I'll try to be on the positive side now, since I played a lot of doom in my presentation. On the positive side, data transparency goes a long way. People don't like being called out on the carpet. And so the more we're able to expose these issues, the better. I want to emphasize, though, that the vast majority of these problems were not out of malicious intent, but just people being people, fallible, just mistakes and problems. That's the vast majority of shortages. 66% were due to quality issues, and of those, a very tiny fraction were intentional. And even those that were intentional, they were intentional with the hope that it wasn't going to cause the product to go bad in the first place. So really the answer isn't really in getting people scared to do the wrong thing. It's really inspiring people to go a step ahead and not just do the minimum, but really to build a more robust system. So Dr. Rabbani, I like this one question here about the transportation. I want to mention something really interesting. Ask how important is transportation in the supply chain? Super important. It's super important because it's not always so straightforward. We talked about cold chain, which is a fancy term for you got to move it in a refrigerator. It matters a lot, and for vaccines, actually, it can matter a huge amount. For partially killed vaccines, it just won't work at all if it's not kept in a cold chain. But let me just give you a specific example from the pandemic. One of the first things that happened in the pandemic is people stopped traveling. It was good. The second thing, of course, is planes stopped flying, because why fly if no one's traveling? Well, that's fine. Actually, it's good for the environment. The skies got bluer. The vast majority, maybe not 100%, but almost 100% of medicine moves in the belly of passenger planes. They travel the most. They go everywhere in the world. Airlines pretty much make their money on freight. The people just pay for the costs of the fuel. They stopped flying. Medicine couldn't move. And the first thing that got impacted was all the ingredients. They weren't getting to the factories. Factories couldn't make the medicines. Supply chain started to shut. It took a few weeks. We saw a shock run through the system. We followed it from China early, because China felt it first, right? And we watched it. And China stopped shipping its API. It didn't get to India. About 6 weeks later, India started to slow down its production of medicine because they started running out of ingredients. About 6 weeks after that, we started seeing the shortages start to show up in the US for those first medicines. We're only 3 months in. We're just seeing now the shortages, and they started spiking in the end of May and into early June, from all the way back to the China shutdown in January. That's how long it takes to work through the system. And some of that just simply triggered by fewer United and American Airlines flights. So yeah, it matters a lot.
Dr. Piervincenzi, if you do have time for one more question, I did have one sent privately to me, so I just want to make sure that that person gets a chance as well. So It's from Paul, and he says, for several products made in the US or overseas, there can be a common starting material, which is converted by varied manufacturers as an ultimate step, often a chemical reaction. An example, the sartan contamination event of last year.
Yeah.
What can USP do to support FDA and other agencies to diversify that early supply chain?
Yeah, so let me give a really cool answer to that. The most isn't even fair. 99% of medicine in the world is made by a technique invented in the 1950s and relatively unchanged since then. Every other manufacturing sector in the world, including just cheap plastic toys, have moved on to more sophisticated manufacturing methods. One solution to problems like that, not only that one, but like that, are these what are called advanced manufacturing. And again, I'll say advanced for pharmaceutical manufacturing isn't really advanced for other industries. If you showed that to an auto plant, they would look at you and say, that's advanced. That's what we were doing in the late 1970s. But they say, systems that are continuous, rather than creating batches of medicine, having a continuous system that's adding ingredients in the beginning, changing chemical reactions along the way, even packaging them, adding excipients, packing them up into their final form. A continuous system allows you to adjust and change your chemistry as you go. You're measuring as you go. And it also allows you to move upstream a bit more and do some of your earlier reactions and change them if your ingredient were to change. So here's a method that, again, doesn't solve all the problems, but is one potential solution. The other part is if everybody is making the medicine from one single precursor ingredient, pay someone to make it. Pay another person to make that medicine. Don't let it be one, at least make it two, and have somebody else make it. Well, why won't somebody else make it? Because it's probably not profitable. So pay them. It's worth a few bucks for us to not have to get cancer from our cardiovascular drugs. These generics cost 3 cents a pill. Would you be willing to pay 3.5 cents a pill to not get cancer? Yes, it's fine. It's no problem. Anybody can pay an extra 0.5 cent a day for their life-saving medicine. But we're not making those choices because it's not really available to us. We don't even know what we pay for our medicine. Forget about where the medicines come from.
Okay, looks like we answered all the questions. I want to thank Dr. Piervincenzi for the wonderful presentation. I think one question just came in, how to handle issue of intellectual property rights to produce in other countries. As you know, that's another heated discussion that certain countries are accused of not honoring our intellectual properties in US. Is that a problem with these medications also? Or for instance, if a country decides to make a generic version of something which is not approved for them to do yet, what role does IP play?
Yeah, well, I don't know what role the IP plays, but what role do courts and police play? I think you should ask someone in Duke Law School how to fix it. I raise it for vaccines. The problem is obvious. I mean, it's obvious to, I think, everybody that it will become, it'll be a part of the solution because there'll be a rational approach. Several European countries are working with the WHO to create a shared agreement ahead of time. See, I don't know where it comes from, but if we all agree, whoever gets it is going to help the others to get it ahead of time. But if China and the US don't participate, and we're not, and that's where most of the vaccines are being produced, it probably won't even help. And then we're more likely to end up in a place where whoever gets it, whoever finds it, gets to make it, provide it for their population first, and only when they have gotten all they need do they start to export it. And in the meantime, others will probably start to copy it, successfully or not. That's honestly more likely.
Okay, thanks again, Ron, for the wonderful presentation. As Carrie Ann stated earlier, this is our first presentation for our executive lecture series for this summer. We are hoping to have 4 topics, 2 for June and 2 for July. And Carrie Ann can give us information about when the next one is scheduled for. But before I turn the floor or the Zoom video to her, again, I want to thank Ron for the wonderful presentation he gave, and I also thank all the participants who joined us and contributed to this event. Thank you.